Buon pomeriggio, benvenuti. Good afternoon, I'm Barbara Faedda, the Italian Academy's Associate Director, and it is my pleasure to welcome all of you to the Academy today. This is the second welcome for those of you who joined us last night. As some of you already heard yesterday, a night at the opening of a very successful exhibition downstairs, the Academy accepted the initial proposal for these two initiatives with great enthusiasm. This is not only because today's topic is important and timely, but also because we at the Academy established 2 years ago the International Observatory for Cultural Heritage, with a clear aim of working on the conservation, preservation, and protection of cultural heritage, and on the contemporary destruction of art and architecture. The Observatory is very much interested in emphasizing diversity in cultural expression and in supporting a broad concept of cultural heritage. Since its inception, we have organized a dense series of events made of conferences, symposia, lectures, and exhibitions. Thanks to distinguished and brilliant scholars, professionals, and curators, we have been able to stimulate and feed productive discussions on cultural heritage in conflict zones, on the threatened heritage of Native Americans, on antiquities trafficking, on war and art, and much more. Let me say once again that we are so pleased to have produced an incredible initiative, thanks to a fruitful collaboration with several institutions and persons within and beyond Columbia University, across many disciplines and geographical frontiers. For details on today's symposium, I leave the stage to our partners. Please join me in welcoming Professor Brian Boyd. Thank you.
Hello everyone, thanks for coming again, if you came last night. I'm just going to restrict my contribution here to introducing the panel today. But I should reiterate our thanks from last night also to Barbara, Alison, David Freeberg and Baron from the Italian Academy. Thank you for your generosity in providing the space and your technical assistance. Also thanks to Studio X and the Columbia Global Centres in Amman, Nora Akawi, Safan Nasri, also the Society of Fellows and the Heyman Centre, the Department of Religion, and my colleagues at the Centre for Palestine Studies, Helen Malco, Mariana Pecorano, Dana Black, and Nasreen Abdallah. Okay, so this afternoon we're going to hear from Debbie Farber, the curator of the exhibition, and from Bashir Manneh and Nadia Ben Youssef on the panel, followed by comments by Audra Simpson and Q&A moderated by Nadia El-Haj. Debbie Farber is the curator of the NGO Zochrot, which is remembering in Hebrew, an Israeli organization working to promote acknowledgement and accountability for the ongoing injustices of the Naqab. Between 2012 and 2014, she served as the Civil Transitional Justice Program Director in Zochrot, where she established the first unofficial Truth Commission in Israel for the events of 1948 in the Naqab. Debby is a former AHDA Fellow of the Institute for the Study of Human Rights at Columbia, and is currently also a PhD candidate in the Politics and Government Department in Ben-Gurion University, where she explores the linkages between visual culture, history, and political geography within the visual historiography of Israel-Palestine. Bashir Manneh is reader in post-colonial literature and director of the Centre for Post-Colonial Studies at the University of Kent, Canterbury in the UK, and author of the Palestinian novel from 1948 to the present, Cambridge University Press, 2016, and students available online via the Columbia Library. And fiction of the New Statesman, 1913 to 1939, 2011. And we're all enormously looking forward to his edited book, which is coming out at the end of December, on Edward Said as critic and theorist. After Said, post-colonial literary studies in the 21st century, also Cambridge University Press. Nadia Ben Youssef is the co-founder and director of Adalah Justice Project and works at the intersection of law, advocacy and art to advance human rights. Prior to leading AGP, she worked with Adalah, the Legal Center for Arab Minority Rights in Israel, which is a sister project to Adalah, both in Palestine, Israel and in the US. She coordinated Adalah's international advocacy on behalf of the Indigenous Palestinian Bedouin community in the Naqab, and most recently served as the organization's first USA representative. As an outgrowth of her work in the US, AGP was launched in February 2017 to influence American policy and practice in Palestine, Israel. Much of the work of AGP has focused on building a transnational movement against supremacy and state-sanctioned violence, together with cause lawyers, community organizers and artists across diverse movements for social justice. Nadia is also a member of the New York State Bar and holds a BA in sociology from Princeton and a JD from Boston College Law School. And I urge you to look at adalahjusticeproject.org for more information. So following the panel presentations by Bashir and Nadia, Dr. Simpson will provide us with some comments. Audra is Professor of Anthropology here at Columbia. She researches and writes about Indigenous and settler society, politics and history. She's the author of Mohawk Interruptus, Political Life Across the Border of Settler States, Duke University Press 2014, which is the winner of the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association's Best First Book in Native American and Indigenous Studies Prize, the Laura Romero Prize from the American Studies Association, as well as the Sharon Stevens Prize from the American Ethnological Society 2015. She is also co-editor of Theorizing Native Studies, Duke 2014, and has published numerous articles in post-colonial studies, cultural anthropology, American Quarterly Junctures, and so on. And last but not least, Nadia El-Haj is Professor of Anthropology at Barnard in Columbia. Nadia is author of Facts on the Ground, Archaeological Practice and Territorial Self-Fashioning in Israeli Society, which won the Albert Harani Award of the Middle East Studies Association, and also Genealogical Science, The Search for Jewish Origins and the Politics of Epistemology, also Chicago Press 2012. She's held fellowships at Harvard University's Academy for International and Area Studies and the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton. In addition, she's a former Fulbright Fellow and a recipient of awards from the SSRC MacArthur Grant in International Peace and Security, the Wenner Gren Foundation, and the National Endowment for the Humanities, among others. So without further ado, I will pass over to Debby Farber from Zochrot. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining the conference. So I would like to begin as well with short thanks and express my sincere gratitude to Helen Marco, Brian Boyd, Nadia El-Haj, Rashid Khalidi, Brinkley Messick, Laila Abulud, and Nora Akawi, the Center for Palestine Studies, and Naor Ben-Yehuda for their collaboration for more than a year now, leading to this exhibition and this conference. I'm deeply grateful to the Italian Academy, to David Friedberg, Alison Jeffrey, Barbara Fida, and Baron Preston for the generous hosting and the support and collaboration. I want to thank my colleagues and partners at Forensic Architecture, a research agency based in Goldsmith University in London, and especially to Eyal Weizmann and Ariel Ken for years of collaboration. Finally, and most importantly, I thank our friends and comrades, the courageous and resilient residents of the Palestinian Bedouin villages of Al-Araqib and al-Khiran, for trusting us and for working with us on our joint project presented in the exhibition here at the Academy. So before I start, I would like you to listen to a very short recorded speech by one of our most prominent activists in Al-Araqib village, Aziz Al-Touri, who requested to wish you a greeting in the beginning of the panel. So this is Aziz.
Assalamu alaikum. Good afternoon. I am Aziz Al-Turi, the son of Sheikh Sayyah Al-Turi. I am talking to you from the unrecognized village Al-Araqib. First, I am grateful to anyone who helped organize this conference, and specific I grateful to the Center of Palestinian Studies at Columbia University in New York, and I thank a lot Zochrot. I born here in Al-Araqib at 1974. By my hand, I plant trees. I traveling and I feeding my animals here in Al-Araqib. When I was young, I continue my life here in Al-Araqib. I married here. I built a house here, and I continue my life here since I born until now. But the government, since Israel established until now, looking for us like invaders. In past, since Israel established, they leave us to live under this name, unrecognized village. That means no services, no water running, no schools, no clinic, no roads, nothing. We continue our life here like a normal by ourselves. We plant trees. We make our area so beautiful, so green. And we make our job here, agriculture job. We had here in Al-Araqib, before the big demolition, before 2010, we had 4,500 olive trees, and we had a sheep, and we make oil, and we sell. We make cheese and milk and afiq, and we sell. And we was 5,073 people living in Al-Araqib. And the important here, no one unemployed people. All of us was worker, and we have a good relationship between the families. The government decided at 2010 to demolish Al-Araqib total, because we are unrecognized villages. That mean illegal villages. That mean they can destroy our village anytime that the government want. We continue our life after the big demolition, after 2010 until now. And since 2010 until now, the government destroy our village 134 times, and we continue our life like a normal here. There is no democratia about the Arabs here in Israel. All of the time, the government send the police to destroy and to demolish our houses, our simple houses, and the government try to breaking our peace struggle. And they opened against us different cases in the court, civil cases and the criminal cases. And the last cases against my father, Sheikh Sayyah, and the judge decided to send my father, Sheikh Sayyah, to 10 months in the jail. You can imagine they opened against Sheikh Sayyah more than 70 criminal cases in the court, in the Israeli court. Against me, I have more than 20 criminal cases in the court. And they ask us to leave our land and to sell our land to the government. Why? Because we are Arabs. We ask the free people during the war to help us in Al-Araqib, especially, and in the Negev total, to stop the demolition and to find solution. We ask the government to recognize our land, to recognize our village, and to stop demolition. There is a big lie during the war, and specific in America, in the United States. There is a group that called the GNF, the Jewish National Fund. By the Jewish National Fund, they confiscate our land and plant trees here. They uproot our trees and plant new trees. It means that this GNF delete our history and plant a new history. I thank everybody that he heard me now and he can help us. I ask them and I ask you to donate Al-Araqib, to make media during Al-Araqib, and to try to stop this demolition. I thank everybody. I thank you a lot. Please help us. Please make any conference against the GNF. And in the end, I thank the Jew activism because they helped us and they helped my son to grow without hating Jew nationality. My son, he didn't hating the Jew, but my son, he cannot welcome the police. My son, he cannot take the GNF with welcome with a happy face. And thank you a lot.
Thank you for listening. I would like to begin my talk today by referring to the title which was chosen for this panel, from Res Nullius to Terra Nullius. Israel's approach to indigenous Palestinian Bedouins in the Naqab developed during its formative years and very much consistent with the colonial legal geographic concept of Terra Nullius, meaning land legally owned by no one. The notion of Terra Nullius derives from the Roman legal concept of Res Nullius. It represents land devoid of sovereignty, ownership, or long-term possession rights. The concept had informed practices used by mostly European colonial regimes and settlers to dispossess indigenous population, exploit the natural resources, and settle on their lands. By legitimizing indigenous histories, legal systems, and property rights, and granting such rights to the newcomers, Terra Nullius is one of the most effective and notorious hallmarks of the colonial era. Terra Nullius is thus more than a legal or illegal concept. It is a frame of mind typifying settler societies and colonizing regimes involved in ongoing external or internal expansion, often at the expense of indigenous groups and national minorities. The powerful effect of the concept is thus cultural, historical, and ultimately political. Systematic denial of indigenous people ownership rights on their lands, resources, and political power. The implementation of the principle had also led to the dispossession of native people in Australia, Canada, the US, and elsewhere. In Palestine, this principle had been applied most extensively in the semi-arid Naqab region in the south. I deliberately use its Arabic, rather the Hebrew name, the Negev, as a symbolic way of challenging the Zionist practice of renaming the colonized landscape. As geographers Oren Iftachel, Ahmad Amara, and Sandy Kedar show, the Naqab had never been officially designated as Terra Nullius, but the concept was introduced implicitly through policies that emptied the territory, through the distortion of the British and Ottoman land registrations, the erasure of Palestinian Bedouin past, and the denial of their customary law, property regime, right to return, and freedom of movement. At the heart of this distortion lied the legal classification by Israel of the entire region as dead land, or in Arabic, mawat. The term derives from Muslim tradition, later appears in 1858 Ottoman Land Code and in the British Mandate legislation. Israeli legal authorities formulated what Oren Iftachel termed as the dead Negev doctrine, a set of legal assertions based on putative, geographic, and historical assumptions under which all land held, used, and inherited, purchased, and inhabited by Negev Bedouins is considered dead, with its rightful owner being a Jewish state. Note that for the Israeli regime, acknowledging the Bedouins as an indigenous community, part of the indigenous Palestinian people residing in the state of Israel, dramatically challenges the myth of the Jewish people returning to their ancestral Holy Land, and actually turns the Jewish people themselves into transgressors and transgressors. This inherent contradiction is at the heart of the ongoing injustice done to the Palestinians, what is often called the conflict. And this exhibition seeks to demonstrate and subvert its logic as manifested in the Naqab. The villagers of Al-Araqib and al-Khiran were among some 11,000 Palestinian Bedouins who had managed to remain in the Naqab following the Nakba. The others, about 85 Palestinian Bedouins, had been previously dispossessed by the Jewish military forces and expelled to Jordan, the West Bank, or to Gaza. Today, almost 250,000 Bedouins live in the Naqab and are considered to be the poorest and the most marginal sectors in Israel-Palestine. More than 80,000 of them live in 35 unrecognized villages illegalized by the state, and another 135,000 reside in government-planned concentration towns. Those living in unrecognized villages are denied basic services such as water, electricity, education, health, and housing. They live off the map and out of the sight. As Laila Abulur and Ahmad Saadi remind us, the Nakba is not a singular event, but rather an ongoing reality of injustices, dispossession, and displacement. The Palestinian Bedouins are a case in point, a colonized indigenous people within a settler colonial society, rendered transgressors on their ancestral land by Israeli law. Most of the remains and physical traces of their settlements and cultivation of lands, testifying to the permanent residency, have been eliminated through the proliferation of state-sponsored Jewish settlements, forced urbanization, and afforestation, as Aziz told us, by the Jewish National Fund. These and other practices have served the Israeli regime since 1948 to prevent the return of Palestinian refugees while covering the remains of their past with an Israeli present. The village of Al-Araqib, in particular, had come to symbolize Palestinian resistance to the ongoing Nakba. The village residents had been residing in the Naqab already since the 19th century, living in small clusters on collectively held semi-arid land and enjoying relative autonomy from the Turkish and British rulers who recognized their indigenous property system. Although the families of Al-Araqib did manage to stay on their lands in 1948, they were later evicted in 1951 to make temporary room for Israeli military exercise, given the promise that they would be able to return after 6 months, a promise which was never respected till these days. Nevertheless, throughout the years, the village residents continued to cultivate their ancestral lands, and over the years, some returned to build shacks and houses, and actually inhabit them despite Israel's relentless efforts to suppress and delegitimize their resettlement. The situation in Al-Araqib escalated in the early 2000s, culminating in the first destruction Aziz told us about by the Israeli Land Authority on the 27th of July 2010. This act of state violence left about 500 people without shelter. Since then, the village was destroyed and rebuilt more than 130 times by the small group of families of Al-Turi. Despite the eviction notices, fines, legal proceedings against them, they continue to realize the right of return through implementing the non-violent sumud. Zochrot's collaboration with Al-Araqib began 3 years ago in January 2016 in the concluding session of its unofficial Truth Commission held in the village. This two-day event was launched by erection of a large Bedouin tent next to Al-Araqib cemetery, where the participants were hosted. Something disappeared. Never mind. This event was held in collaboration with Forensic Architecture Research Agency from Goldsmith University in London. Forensic architecture, I will say shortly to those of you who don't know, is a multidisciplinary group of architects, scientists, journalists, lawyers, artists, and programmers established by Israeli architect Eyal Weizman, which provides international prosecutors and activists with evidence of human rights violation where more conventional approaches fail. In Al-Araqib, the contribution was particularly essential given the ongoing efforts by the Jewish state to erase all traces of injustices, working to produce expert testimonies to the commission assembled in this alternative forum. During the event, we presented evidence and oral testimonies and produced on-site evidence in real time, engaging the audience as witnesses and active participants in truth-making. The event and the knowledge produced throughout this intervention laid the groundwork for the Ground Truth online platform developed over the past 3 years, whose outcomes you can see in the exhibition downstairs. The platform presents geo-referenced 3D point cloud photo terrains assembled by contemporary kite or balloon aerial imagery, a DIY practice developed by the Public Laboratory for Open Science and Technology. These 3D documentations show the form and volume of disappearing Bedouin structures, while also facilitating a continued tracking of their deterioration over time. Royal Air Force aerial images of the area from 1945 were geo-referenced to create overlays that enabled close comparisons of Bedouin environment across space and time. All visual materials are cross-referenced with a range of legal, historical, and material evidence. Thus, the platform, still a work in progress, documents the continuity of the sedentary presence of the Bedouins on this land, as well as their displacement and other violent acts by the government bent on this arising of this past. The second investigation concerns the village of al-Khiran. 500 Palestinian Bedouins currently reside there. Their original lands are in the area of Khirbet Zbale in the northwestern Naqab. After living there for centuries, the area was occupied in 1948 and they were forced out to clear the space for the establishment of Kibbutz Shuval, a new Jewish settlement. In 1956, they were displaced once again by the military governor, and their territory was and 1,700 acres were leased to them in the area of Yatir, where they have resided since. The village residents walked the lands in the new territory, dug wells, and paved roads. In 1963, the state started to reduce the area leased to the families, partially by transferring them to the Jewish National Fund for afforestation purposes. Then, in the 80s, the state completely stopped the leasing to them after turning them into groves. In 2001, the dispossession led to a new level of violence, as the whole area was now designated for a new Jewish settlement, Hiran. The fact that the residents had been residing in the area legally, even in Israeli terms, was completely ignored. The residents were declared transpersers, and ongoing cycles of destruction and displacement became the village's fate. The investigation presented in the exhibition focused on the events of January 2017. Hundreds of Israeli police officers raided the village, resulting in the death of the village respected educator Yaqub Musa Abul-Kian and the Israeli policeman Erez Levy. Official reports claim that the incident was a terror attack in which Abul-Kian ran over the policeman with his car, leaving the police with no other choice than to shoot him dead. The Minister, Public Security, and the Chief of Police even claimed that the terrorist had links to ISIS. Local residents and activists who were present on site when the incident took place, however, testified that the police shot Abul-Kian without provocation, leading to widespread speculations that Levy was shot by his fellow officers. The day following the killing, the Israeli police made an error. They released on their social media a crucial piece of evidence. It was an aerial footage of the incident. It showed, they wrote, the terrorist vehicle with his lights off, accelerating and charging on the security forces. And then, by superimposing the drone video of the police with sound documentation, which was sent to forensic architecture by an active stills photographer, Karen Manor, who was on the ground during the killing, a different story was revealed. It was now clear that Abul-Kian was shot before the car accelerated and reached a group of policemen. Forensic architecture investigation, investigation later revealed that the car acceleration was a result of the gunfire that disabled Abul-Kian and led him to lose control over the vehicle. At the end of 2017, the case against the police officers involved in the shooting of Abul-Kian was quietly closed. Despite the fact that forensic architecture helped expose the official lies through social media and local mainstream media, the police eventually decided not to hold the policeman responsible for shooting Abul-Kian. The police argument is familiar from other cases of police shootings worldwide. Security personnel must make split-second decisions to use lethal force when they feel theirs or other life are in danger. When an error occurs, the question is only whether their reaction can be justified by their perception of reality at the moment. In our case, the crucial question is why a Palestinian Bedouin man driving slowly outside of his soon-to-be-demolished house is perceived as a threat justifying lethal force. Part of the answer is that the instincts of these police officers are culturally and politically conditioned, and that the victims of police violence in Israel are disproportionately Palestinians. Just as in the US, those are disproportionately African Americans. In its almost automatic designation of Palestinian or African American bodies as a threat, the retrospective justification shrinks a long history of marginalization and dispossession in a split second. And I will leave you with that. Thank you.
Hi. Thank you for Nadia and Brian for Palestine Studies for this invitation. I'm happy to be here with Debby, Nadia as well, to talk about this topic. My brief was to provide a sort of general context for Israeli policy over Palestinian dispossession and to leave it to the expert to discuss things more in more concrete terms in relation to the Naqab. So in opening the Shimon Peres Negev Nuclear Research Center, the Prime Minister of Israel made the following statement recently. He said, "In the Middle East and in many parts of the world, there is a simple truth. There is no place for the weak. The weak crumble, are slaughtered and erased from history, while the strong, for good or ill, survive. The strong are respected and alliances are made with the strong. And in the end, peace is made with the strong." End of quote. Some journalists in Israel were understandably outraged by the statement, not many, and criticized the Prime Minister for what they described as its neo-fascist logic. I'm not interested in name-calling this position, nor in exploring what it might echo historically. And I do understand why a statement like this from the representative of a self-designated victim state founded to protect victims of the Holocaust would cause consternation. What I am interested in is putting this statement in its Israeli context. Because I do think that what is being articulated here, the logic of living by the sword and erasing the weak from history, actually runs deep in Israel. It is not just that it describes Israel's own conception of its relations to its regional enemies, like Iran, but more importantly, it articulates Israel's worldview in relation to its long-standing national enemies, the Palestinians that it regards as an existential threat. So I'd like to propose that the word that describes most accurately the tenet that the Israeli Prime Minister articulates here is politicide. This is coined by Israeli political sociologist Al-Araqib. It captures the broad and multidimensional historical process of a settler colonial project that seeks to dispossess, that seeks to render dispensable and replace a majority colonized population, rather than either exploit it as cheap labor or physically annihilate it. Politicide also captures the various mechanisms of dispossession required in order to achieve that aim, that of the foundational mass expulsion, the expropriation of core means of livelihood, and the denial of rights, the denial of opportunities and freedoms available to the settled population. As a concept, it speaks to many different kinds of realities in Israel and Palestine. The erection of walls of segregation, political assassinations, economic exclusion, political disenfranchisement, military sieges, endless incursions, and all-out wars against a defenseless population. For Kimmerling, what's distinctive about politicide is the following, and I'm using his terms here and I'm quoting directly. The term politicide means a process of preventing one ethno-national entity from achieving an enduring self-determination, he says, through the denial of its legitimacy and the systematic annihilation of its leadership, its material, economic, political, and cultural infrastructure, end of quote. Here, prevention of national determination is a core objective and takes many different kinds of forms. As he also elaborates, and I'm quoting again, the process of politicide, in addition to breaking Palestinians' political identity and institutions, may also, but not necessarily, include their gradual, partial, or complete ethnic cleansing from the territory known as the Land of Israel, or historic Palestine, he says, as attempted, he says, during the 1948 war. There is then what can be called a peacetime politicide. This is a routine, everyday, and at times extremely bureaucratic process of dispossession and the delegitimization of collective existence. That happens all the time in Israel and Palestine, and it defines Israeli state practices towards all Palestinians. You can explain the new nation state law with it, which gives rights and privileges to Jews only in Israel and legally denies Palestinians the right of self-determination. You can use it to explain the systematic discrimination, racism, and intensive security surveillance against Palestinians in Israel, denying them civic and political rights available to Jewish citizens. And you can also use it to explain state policies in the occupied Palestinian West Bank and Gaza, like segregated roads, denial of freedom of movement, house demolitions, land theft by Israel, curfews, collective punishments, Jewish settlements, etc. All of these practices of everyday politicide violate international law and convention and exist to facilitate a peacetime transfer of population, leaving one's homeland out of despair and out of resignation. The case of Al-Araqib epitomizes this process. Khan al-Ahmar in the West Bank is another example. It's a Bedouin village whose presence is seen as an obstruction to Israel's colonization plans in the area. The Bedouin communities in the Jordan Valley, which Amira Haas writes about all the time in her articles, are yet another example of this. Bedouins there are told, these are direct quotes, go to Arafat by Israeli soldiers, meaning go to PA controlled areas, leave Area C and go to PA controlled areas, to Arafat areas. Such relentless destruction, internal displacement, and dissolution of independent communities is routine. And it has been happening across historic Palestine since 1948. And to both Palestinian citizens of Israel, as you see, and to occupied Palestinians as well. What this instills in Palestinians is the feeling that they are never safe, that they are never secure, that they are tolerated guests in their own homes, anxiously waiting for the day that their ordinary presence would directly conflict with colonial design and lead to either erasure or to total economic dependency on their occupiers. Everyday politicide is a stark reminder that a military solution of forced mass exile is potentially never far away, merely awaiting appropriate conditions in more amenable circumstances. If Kimmerling, before he died, wrote, and I'm quoting again, that ethnic cleansing which was possible, he said, in 1948, could not be carried out today under any circumstances without bringing down moral and political devastation, he says, on the perpetrators as well. This might sound a little bit too optimistic in today's violent global environment. For example, Myanmar has just expelled 800,000 Rohingyas and committed war crimes and crimes against humanity, and millions of Syrians have been externally and internally displaced by a brutal dictator and his powerful allies, ready to destroy a country rather than drown citizens their democratic rights. To be certain that Israel will never mass expel again, if it could, in order to resolve its founding contradiction, is not to know Israel's state managers. Many an Israeli watcher would today agree that Ze'ev Sternhell's conclusion about the founders of Israel still applies today. He said, this is from the Founding Myths of Israel's book, he said, and I'm quoting, "In principle, there were no limits to their nationalist extremism. The limits were fixed by conditions prevailing at a given time, by the limits of power, and by that of the Yeshua," end of quote. So long as the upbuilding of Jewish sovereignty in all of historic Palestine remains the primary objective, then those deemed enemies by Israel remain at risk. What I'm suggesting is that because everyday politicide is so prevalent and so constitutive in Israel, mass expulsion or the forcible removal of population is always a potential. Peacetime politicide can easily turn into the more extreme and more destructive form of wartime politicide. Its most striking example is, of course, the forced displacement of the majority of the Palestinians in 1948, when 750,000 Palestinians were expelled from their homes, 530 towns and villages were destroyed. In 1967, there was another occasion for mass expulsion. 250,000 Palestinians were pushed out during the war. Because of the link between peacetime and wartime politicide, and because it is 70 years to the Naqab this year, I would like to focus on the Naqab's core features very briefly. And I do so not only for the purposes of historical understanding, but for contemporary purposes as well, in order to propose that until Israeli society acknowledges and rectifies the Naqab, reckons with its own state violence, and acts to end the politicide of the Palestinians, neither Palestinians nor Israelis for that matter, will ever be safe in Israel and Palestine. And repetition of mass expulsion of the weak remains an inherent potentiality. So what of the events of 1948? Evidence suggests that the Naqba was thought out in advance. It was pre-imagined by its perpetrators. Historians like Noor Masalha have charted the prevalence of the pre-state what he describes as transverse ideologies, term used by Zionists, and amongst the Yeshuv's political elite. Ben-Gurion articulated best when he said in 1938, straight out stated, and I'm quoting, "I support compulsory transfer, and I don't see in it anything immoral," end of quote. Transfer took such a deep hold of the dominant group in the Yeshuv that in 1948 it became, in the words of Benny Morris, a prevailing atmosphere. There is, he says, Morris, an atmosphere of population transfer. The transfer idea is in the air, he says. The entire leadership understands that this is the idea. The officer corps understands what is required of them. Under Ben-Gurion, Morris concludes, a consensus of transfer is created. End of quote. That's why soldiers conducting destruction and depopulation operations reported a guiding hand directing action. So what transfer had going for it as an idea is clear. Out of the range of other possible options like coexistence or sharing land, The Yishuv elite selected transfer because it resolved in one swoop the whole question of creating an exclusive Jewish state in the majority Arab area. Without transfer, there was no state and no Jewish sovereignty in Palestine. Morris recognizes this in his crudely entitled Harris interview with Ari Shavit, another hero, Survival of the Fittest. And this is a direct quote from that interview. Ben Gurion was a transferist. He understood that there could be no Jewish state, this is Benny Morris, with a large and hostile Arab minority in its midst. There would be no such state. It would not be able to exist. End of quote. For Israel to exist, the Naqab was a prerequisite. An unjust and inequitable UN partition plan in 1947 presented the Yishuv with an opportunity essentially to execute compulsory transfer. As Morris's evidence suggests, though he continues to deny it does, rather peculiar, psychologically, there you have it. A broad military political consensus did constitute a policy of expulsion. What Palestinians had experienced was what actually happened in 1948. Expulsion was organized, it was systematic, and it was premeditated. For those who need more paper evidence, as if without a text, lived reality doesn't exist, it's good to remember that most of the Israeli military archives from 1948 have never been open to the public, they've just been closed again, haven't been still closed. And that what Morris based his research on is a very small percentage of what actually exists. Was there then an intent to cleanse? Yes. To cleanse Arabs? Yes. Was there a purposeful action to realize this singular aim? Yes. Plan D ordered Yishuv soldiers to expel defenseless civilians, depopulate and conquer Palestinian towns and villages, and to do so even before the British forces had left Palestine. Securing territory meant mass expulsion. This was followed by a policy of active prevention, infiltration in Israeli parlance, in which up to 5,000 unarmed returning refugees were murdered. We will not let the Arabs back, is a direct quote from Ben Gurion, stated in 1948 in December. A quick review of the language, maybe the language of the Naqab, would be also interesting to think about. That Jewish forces used for military orders and operations is very revealing. The list is masalhas, and here it is: tehur, or letaher, cleaning or purging; nikui, clearing; hisul, liquidation; gerush, expulsion; lehashmid, to destroy or to exterminate; lefanot, to evacuate; pinui, evacuation; mifza matateh, operation broom; perolat misparaim, operation scissors. It was hoped that the Galilee would become clean, naki, and empty, rek, of Arabs. This is from Morris, another example from Morris. The 51st Battalion was ordered to take the large village of Tal al-Safi and to, quote, to destroy the enemy's fighting force, to destroy, to kill, and to expel Yashmid, Lahrub, and Garesh, refugees encamped in the area. Jaffa was, as a result, whittled down from over 75,000 Palestinians to 2,000 to 3,000. Haifa was shrunk from around 72,000 to a couple of thousands. Lid and Ramla had to be destroyed too, and Ben Gurion issued a Gareshotam order to expel them. The same happened in Tiberias, Acre, Safat, and hundreds of villages across Palestine. Like in all wars, as you expect, rapes, lootings, forced labor, and general cruelty were also evident. Numerous massacres against unarmed civilians caused panic and terror and induced flights. A conservative estimate is 31 massacres, which spread across the country. One Palestinian researcher, Saleh Abdel Jawad, counted 68 massacres. The largest was probably in the strategically located Lid, Ali Shabit's favorite location. 250 were killed there. It's dubbed the Mosque Massacre. If it's not the Waimi Massacre, where hundreds were killed, the number is not known. 112 civilians were killed in the most famous massacre, were murdered in Deir Yassin, and dozens were lined up and shot in Tantura, near Haifa. Their mass grave today is under a car park. These targeted massacres were clearly effective. If the overall estimate for Palestinians killed in the events of the Nakba is around 5,000, this is relatively a low figure in relation to the hundreds of thousands expelled. And it brings the purpose of the war to even clearer focus. The forcible removal of the civilian population, not its annihilation. Territory was what mattered. Palestinians were in the way. They still are. Hence Morris's deep regret that Ben Gurion left the job unfinished. That remnants of Palestinians who were left behind are now 20% of the population. They are dubbed various terms, demographic threat, time bomb, and part of the mistake, in Morris's words, and I'm quoting again, of the non-completion of the transfer, end of quote. So what the Naqba ultimately meant was the wholesale destruction of Palestinian society. As one history of the Palestinians put it, in the last months of 1947, it says, in the first 4.5 months of 1948, the Arab community in which Palestine ceased to exist as a coherent social and political entity. End of quote. Social, economic, and political life was broken up and disrupted forever. If it is possible to estimate how much land was expropriated and confiscated, for example, the Jews owned 6% of the land in 1948 and a third of the population. If it's also possible to calculate physical and material records of dispossession like property, bank accounts, libraries, etc., how can one measure the destruction of a whole society that existed for centuries? A mainly peasant society lost its existential foothold and was uprooted. Its forms of social organization and institutional structures were nullified, scattered, marginalized, fragmented, and dispossessed of its means of livelihood. Palestinians became a refugee people subject to a myriad of political and economic conditions across the Arab world and beyond. Exile meant poverty and destitution for the many, political repression and persecution, further dislocations from Jordan, Beirut, Kuwait, Iraq, Syria, etc. As political sociologist Samih Farsoon argued, quote, precarious Palestinian existence since the Naqba was about transience, it was about impermanence, and has long generated, he argues, tremendous psychological anxiety and insecurity and constant angst amongst the diaspora Palestinians. End of quote. So the condition of statelessness still haunts Palestinian refugees today, and the collective challenge for Palestinians remains overcoming politicide and establishing an independent political community in Palestine. The Naqba then should be regarded as a form of radical or enduring injustice. I use philosopher Jeff Spinner-Haleb's term to describe historical injustices that he calls as, and I'm quoting, that people still suffer from, injustices, another quote, from the past that persist today and require for remedy. Exile and dispossession, he says, cause radical and nearly always harmful changes in a community, like the loss of feeling at home in the world, of being governed by one's own principles in one's homeland, and of, another quote, pursuing one's own conception of good. From this perspective, the Naqba is an ongoing condition of denial that needs remedy and rectification through restitution and compensatory justice. Even if the framework for resolution is unideal and constrained by a political possibility, addressing enduring injustice is key. If the past can't be fixed, Spinner-Haleb argues, then acknowledging it and, quote, offering hope to victims, end of quote, is essential. Israel is sadly heading in the opposite direction. It is not only deepening the Naqba by denying it and banning its commemoration, but a new discourse has now emerged, blaming the Palestinians for it. The Naqba, as Israeli journalist Ben-Dror Yemeni argued in his Audra recently, is actually self-made. This is another quote for you. Of tens of millions expelled around the world, the Palestinians are the only ones who have adopted an ethos of rejectionism, self-victimization, suffering, and death. They aren't looking for their own good, he says. They have become addicted to the Naqba, which is fully self-made from its inception to this very day. End of quote. The Naqba is in fact Palestinian culture itself, aided and sustained by UNRWA, and peace means the Palestinians being a process of weaning off the Palestinians from their deeply held destructive identity. Riding on this new blame trend, one recent Israeli book argued that peace is when the Palestinians, these are their words, the Palestinian right of return war ends. From the author's perspective, one of the authors used to be a member of Knesset for Labour, of course, unshocking. From the author's perspective, being a Palestinian refugee is a deliberate choice, and it is part of the Palestinian, quote, war whose objective was to prevent the Jewish people from realizing its right to self-determination in its homeland, end of quote. I shall leave aside the fact that the PLO has already recognized Israel as a state, and that all main Palestinian nationalist groups, including Hamas, have long accepted international consensus that a state in the West Bank and Gaza is the only realistic option on the political horizon. This was reiterated again and again. How many times can we hear it? By Sinwar last week, head of Hamas in Gaza. What's intriguing about this discourse, this new discourse, is its culturalist tone. To make peace with Israel, Palestinians have to be re-engineered. They have to be moved away from their self-manufactured identification as refugees, their self-made Naqba identity, and towards Israeli expectations about how they should be as a people. When they conform to Israel's view of them, maybe then peace is possible. Peace is not about political agreements or of redistribution and safeguarding rights, but about cultural rehabilitation and mass re-education. It's about Palestinian ideological baptism in political Zionism. I'll come towards the end of my comments now. Such an elimination of the Nakba is a recipe for more conflict. Rather than providing victims with hope about a better future, aggressive defenders of the status quo seek to rob them of their past and to gut them of their sense of identity as a wronged people. As Walter Benjamin put it, quote, even the dead will not be safe from the enemy if he wins, and this enemy has not ceased to be victorious, end of quote. In the context of Israel-Palestine, reconciling between enemies requires ending repressive politicide and the potential for more military politicide. And we are far away than ever from an Israel able to acknowledge its enduring and ongoing injustices. Public discourse in Israel is very extreme. Just to give you an example, you can listen to Israeli parliamentarian Bezalel Smotrich, whose party is in the current Israeli government that sponsored the new racist nation-state law. For Smotrich, a new Nakba is possible, if not desirable, since there can only ever be one rule in the land of Israel. And if you can't live with that, then you should leave. This is a direct quote from the interview he gave to Haaretz in 2016. When Yeshua ben Nun, the biblical prophet, entered the land, this is Smotrich, he sent 3 messages to its inhabitants. Those who want to accept our rule will accept, those who want to leave will leave, those who want to fight will fight. The basis of his strategy was, we are here, we have come, this is ours. Now 2, 3 doors will open, there is no 4th door. Those who want to leave, and there will be those who leave, I will help them. When they have no hope and no vision, they will go, as they did in 1948, end of quote. What empowers Smotrich to put mass expulsion back on the political horizon is Israel's systematic abortion of hope and of the possibility of Palestinian statehood. If Israel is already a state for Jews only, then for Smotrich, everything in it belongs to Jews as well, regardless of the fact that nearly half of the population of Israel-Palestine now is not Jewish. If Palestinians can't live with that, then they should leave. If they dare resist, he'll push them out. Israel can't be allowed to continue offering the Palestinians from very bad to even worse options. The Palestinian right of self-determination is enshrined in international law, and the only real political question to ask is, what does it take to compel Israel to abide by it? Nothing is eternal, no power is forever, and hope lies in continued struggle for justice. Thank you.
What a great ending, Bashir. Thank you. Thank you to CPS, thank you to Debby, and for all of you for organizing. Before I begin, I just want to acknowledge that we are on Lenape land here on the island of Manhattan. I'm going to talk a bit about the legal context. So I've worked for the last 8 years, the entirety really of my legal career with Adala, a Palestinian human rights organization and legal center based in Haifa, with an office in the Naqab, which is where I began my work in 2010. So I'm going to give you a context of legalized dispossession in the Naqab. How does the law work to confiscate land, displace people in historic Palestine and Israel? But I want to infuse something that I learned from Professor Audra Simpson, which is this idea of refusal, of indigenous refusal. And so I want to infuse in this kind of context of dispossession, yes, ongoing displacement, yes, confiscation of land, with the spirit of resistance that you heard in Aziz's voice. When I met Aziz in 2010, he didn't speak English at all. So it's extraordinary and moving to hear him express himself so beautifully and powerfully in English, for you to understand, for you to hear his story, right? I think to hear his story and to understand what that land means to him, what Al-Araqib means to him. His youngest daughter is named Al-Araqib, actually. I don't know if you'll see her in the exhibit, but I'm going to start with an example of settler colonialism just to get our minds right. map that I dedicate to a young student in New Mexico, and in Albuquerque, a young Dene, a Navajo student. She's 15 years old, and when I showed her this map, I was giving a lecture in Albuquerque at a high school, she said, "It looks like the map of the United States." And I said, "What map of the United States?" She said, "The map that shows the loss of native land over time." Born and educated in this country, born and raised in a small farming community in Montana, surrounded by native reservations, and I had never seen this map. Now, when I speak into advocacy in the United States, this is where I start a lecture on Palestine. It's where I start a lecture on the colonization of historic Palestine by Israel, because it's not about Palestine. It's really not about Palestine, and it is, everything is about Palestine, right? Especially for American audiences, what's important to me, yes, know this map. Know this map because you care about justice. But commit this map to your memory. Commit this map to your discourse. Commit this map to your feet because you walk on stolen land. You walk on stolen land. And if we're about to imagine, Bashir invited us to think beyond this, to decolonization, to a hopeful future, to a vision of the world that we want. It's a vision of the world that looks different here, yes, of course. It can only look different in Palestine if it looks different on Turtle Island. And I want us to keep that in mind as we think through how Israel has managed to displace and confiscate Palestinian land since the Naqab of 1948 until today, how it continues to do that. And as you listen to it, you'll hear resonance, if you know the history of this country, with how this settler colonial regime confiscated land, dispossessed people of their history, of their resources, of their heroes, of their futures, in similar ways. The law is a tool of the powerful, and you'll recognize that, right? You are scholars of history and of anthropology and of law, and you know that the law is a tool of the powerful. Aziz said it, right? Aziz says, these are, and I heard the quote in his voice, these are quote-unquote illegal villages. These are quote-unquote unrecognized villages. Debby, you say they are illegalized by the state, which I love. Illegalized by the state. The law is a tool of the powerful. So I'm going to talk about some of the foundational legal regimes of Israel. I'm going to talk about means and methods of dispossession. And we're going to talk a little bit about the courts, because Adala has represented both the villages of Al-Araqib and of Hiran, so we can talk a bit about that. We're going to give you dates and specific figures and the names of laws, the names of villages. All of that is important, but I think complexity, as much as the law is a tool of the powerful, complexity is also a tool of the powerful. That this situation is so complex that you can't possibly understand it. You need to have a PhD, you need to have, you need to be Palestinian, Jewish, you need to have specific, focused research, read all the books on this issue, and I say no. You have everything that you need to understand this issue. So don't remember, you can remember some of the key dates, of course, but that's not what's important. So I'm just going to talk legalized dispossession, and again, some of this is interesting. What's not, let it go from your mind. I want you to leave here as advocates. I'm a human rights defender, and so I invite you not only to absorb this information as scholars and as intellectuals, I want you to go out and be involved in this community that is struggling for justice. So if you want this PowerPoint, you can have it, but the concept is what's important. So we're going to talk just the first phase of dispossession in the Naqab, specifically. So Bashir gave us a wide view of the Naqab, right? So the Naqab, the vast majority of Palestinians became refugees when the state of Israel was established. And some remained. So we're going to talk about those who remained on the land that became Israel, right? So and in the Naqab specifically, the vast, again, same story. There were 95,000 Bedouin before the state was established. After the state was established, 11,000 remained. Okay, again, figures, not that important. The idea is important. Few remained. They were concentrated to an area called the Siege. So you'll hear the stories of Al-Araqib and Hiran come out in this. They were concentrated into a small area. Debby said they were promised to be able to go back to their land in 6 months. 70 years later, obviously they're not back in their lands. What happened is that the land around the siège, so siège means fence in Arabic, the land around the siège was declared military zone, a closed military zone. That's how people were not allowed to go back, right? What happened is that this closed military zone, all of the land, going also back to Debby, was then considered mawat land, dead land, right? Using this kind of manipulation of Ottoman law, which we'll talk about in a second. And then overnight, with the passage of really important laws, all of that mawat land, all of the closed militarized zone became state land. Israel confiscated and legalized the dispossession of all of that land. It became state land. So the Bedouin who resided on state land, what happened to them overnight? They became what? Trespassers. This is the start of that kind of concept of trespassing on your own land. So these are the laws that were passed. The Absentee Property Law transfers all refugee property to the state. It's supposed to be in this custodian for state property, or custodian for refugee property, but that was privatized really quickly and continues to be privatized. So people are living in refugee homes and refugee land. Land acquisition laws of 53 then kind of legitimized that acquisition, and the land rights settlement ordinance really affirmed this concept of mawat land, which meant that over the course of that time, you have a situation where now 93% of the land of Israel is held by the state. 93% of the land is held in the power of the state. This point is really important to me, which is this idea that we're talking about people who have Israeli citizenship, right? So the Palestinians who remained inside Israel were granted or imposed Israeli citizenship in 1952. I once did a legal chronology of citizenship, comparing the construction of Jewishness in Israel and the construction of whiteness in this country. And this is just an offering of my own ignorance. And I focused a lot on whiteness and Jewishness, looking at specifically the disenfranchisement and dehumanization of black people and black and brown people in this country. It took me a year before I realized that in my legal chronology, I hadn't referenced when Native Americans became citizens in this country. A complete blind spot in my own analysis. The indigenous community in the United States was granted citizenship in 1924. This is the siège. Again, so the concentration, the siège is this kind of dotted line. The community was concentrated in that land, and now you create in that concentration what are called the unrecognized villages. And I'll show you that here. And what I want to uplift is really what those villages are, and they like real villages and people who've been able to create extraordinary places with nothing. What it means to be unrecognized is that you have no water, no roads, no clinics, no schools, no sewage. You're not on any official maps, but nonetheless, these people insisted and planted forests. Al-Araqib, he said 4,500 olive trees that they planted in this village. So 80,000 people live in the unrecognized villages in the Naqab. The second stage of displacement, so you have the legal foundations that say all of this is state land, you are trespassers on state land, was to try to concentrate again the Palestinian community, the Palestinian Bedouin community, into urban towns. So Debby referenced them. These government planned towns, there are 7 of them in the Naqab. They started being built in 1969. And the idea was that the hope is that if you concentrate the Bedouin community, then you control population, there's a demography element to it, kind of control of the land was important to the state of Israel. So what I said here that's important, I think, in terms of resistance and resilience of the Palestinian Bedouin community is that 85% of the people in the government-planned towns are internally displaced people. Those who were, so in that concentration into the siège, there were already people who were living in the siège, right, that have their ancestral villages there. The others that came, those are the ones who had already lost hold of their ancestral land and so agreed to go into these townships, to these government-planned townships. So 85%, those who had hold of their ancestral land, who remained on their land, said, we're not leaving. We're insisting, we're holding this land. There's a beautiful word in Arabic, sumud, which means steadfastness. We're holding on to this land and to this history. So we heard about the situation. And another example of refusal and resistance is what happens when you take farmers and pastoral people into the city. Again, I grew up in Montana. So you say, listen, farmer rancher, you have to go to the big city of Minneapolis or Billings, Montana or something, and they bring their livestock with them. So the Palestinian Bedouin community in these 7 government planned townships said, fine, we'll come with you, but we're taking our livelihood, we're taking our traditions into your dumb urban towns, right? Which I think is just extraordinary. I want to just, again, kind of reiterate what's happening in the unrecognized villages. So I put 46 unrecognized villages. There are, in fact, 35 officially unrecognized villages, meaning 11 villages starting in 2000 really fought the system to get recognition. But nonetheless, even though they are now officially on the map, so if you go to the Naqab, they have signs, like at any Jewish town, they have signs. 11 of those, which fought for recognition, still don't have water, sewage, electricity. They were recognized in 2003. 2003, so there's a really slow process of granting services because there's this spirit of denial that runs through the logic of the state. The denial of services and homes. So denial of permits, there's home demolitions regularly. And a really tragic element of the home demolition process is that now the majority of homes that are demolished, and there's about 1,000 every year, the majority are demolished by the people themselves. Because there's a threat of fines if you don't demolish your home. The state will come in and have to demolish, and then we'll have fines. The village of Al-Araqib, there's massive fines on Sheikh Sayat and others. He was charged and I think is paying $10,000 of fines for the demolition of the homes. This is the situation of unrecognized villages. And in the villages, the spirit of resistance and of refusal is tremendous. And one of my favorite examples is solar power throughout the villages. So they're denied access to the electricity grid. Absolutely no electricity, no water. And the people say, thank you very much. We'll get our own electricity. A village of Terra, a beautiful village near an Air Force base actually. The entire village is Wi-Fi. So you walk in and you have Wi-Fi on your phone, the Terra village. And there's a spirit of ingenuity and vision and green, honestly. There's water pipes and cisterns and recycling water, and it's a pretty extraordinary place. Nonetheless, the dispossession continues. What are the other ways that we can move this community? Through the law, through the denial of services, and then through plans. So are there any urban planners or city planners? Well, we are all subject to such things as city plans and zones and areas that are zoned for specific use. So in 2011, the government announced its latest kind of iteration of displacement with the Farber plan. And the Farber plan really saw in its vision the destruction of these 35 villages and the displacement of the 80,000 people who lived there into the government planned townships. This is the plan, and we'll tell you exactly why they were doing that. But suddenly, they introduced a new legal framework in the Naqab. And the Farber plan only applied to the Bedouin community. The Palestinian Bedouin make up 33% of the Naqab. Again, these are citizens of Israel. The remaining community in the Negev and the Naqab are not subject to these laws. And so interestingly, in terms of examples and the entrenched discrimination in Israel, is that there are single-family farms that were created in 1994. It was a promotion to get people to move to the Naqab, to the Jewish citizens to move to the Naqab. It's the periphery. Here's a plan to make the Negev bloom. And there were 35 towns, and this is an important number, and I just thought it's shocking, really, the universe is so funny. But 35 of these Jewish towns and small individual family farms were built without permits. They were built without permits. It was a fast process of planning, like where do you want the town to go, where do you want your individual family farm to go, and so the 35 were built without permits. And then in 2010, they were retroactively legalized. The law is a tool of who? The powerful. The law is a tool of the powerful. So there are options and there are ways to create justice in the world. The law is often not that tool. So essentially you create two tiers of legal systems, and we'll talk about what that has meant. Now, the Farber plan was devastating in its expression of what it imagined in the Naqab, and there was a huge uprising. And then again, as we're kind of talking about cross-movement struggle and building power, which I'm getting to soon, inshallah, there was a massive uprising of people around the Farber plan, and we use this quote by Ralph Ellison: "I am invisible because you refuse to see me. I'm invisible because you refuse to see me." And in 2013, after massive days of rage in the Naqab, the Farber plan was shelved, which was really extraordinary. So it was shelved officially by the state. Displacement continues, planning continues, but the people also continue to resist. And this is just a sweet example of that resistance and where the spirit and the courage comes from, which is a courage of ancestors, which is a courage of tradition. And this is a clarification and warning that was published in a local newspaper in 2012, which is basically a family, the El-Haj family, that says, listen, our land, by the way, everybody, the land that was just announced by the Israeli Land Administration as for sale and open for development is actually our land, and they say where it is, near the industrial zone of Rahat. And the last line, which is so sweet with these exclamation points, I love it so much, is that this is based in deeply rooted Bedouin custom and tradition. We refuse that you erase our connection to this land. We refuse that you zone land to your liking. We refuse that you do not see us, and we will do it ourselves. We see ourselves, we recognize ourselves. And it's such an extraordinary privilege to be able to tell the story of the Naqab whenever I can. My heart is in the Naqab, and my heart is in these people who refuse and resist in beautiful ways. And on the flip side, what's happening, and I guess we'll see in terms of some of these villages, what is planned on top of the unrecognized villages? Development-induced displacement, if you've heard of this idea, this is good for the people, it's good for the polis, it's good for our society, to build military facilities, to plant forests, to pave roads, to establish these farms, and we've heard about Umm a few more things, dispossession through the courts. So Audra uses the courts to protect the rights of Palestinians. What does it mean to use the law and the legal regime of the oppressor to protect the rights of the oppressed? How do you do it? Why do you do it? I'd be happy to go into that a little bit if you're interested later in the Q&A. Because it is a question, right? And actually, after this case in 1984, the case of El-Haj, there was a lot of fear instilled in human rights defenders and cause lawyers about taking land cases. Because this created a terrible precedent saying that, Mawat, land meant that you have no rights to it, that if you don't have deeds, you can't come to the court. So 200 cases were dismissed after Hawashli. Nonetheless, in some cases, we decided to continue to go because we had additional evidence. And I want us to consider that. Maybe Professor Simpson will take us into that question, the need for evidence of indigenous peoples besides their history and their presence. And the cases of 2015 that are important here at Al-Araqib and Umm we went forward. In Al-Araqib, they were represented by human rights lawyer Michael Sfard, and he went forward because Al-Araqib family has deeds, has the written deeds that they purchased land from. You saw it from the ground truth work. They were taking records. People have this information, so they thought, well, of course, now that we have the deeds, this maybe is different. Like, this case is not going to apply because we have the information. Absolutely denied. In Umm the community was, and Debby told us, was brought there by military order. They were brought there by military order, and they had a military deed for this 7,000 dunams of land in Umm And so they said, oh my God, this great thing that we discovered because they're not trespassers. So the main argument of the state that the Bedouin are trespassers, we've just disproved it. Let us go to the case. It was a 13-year legal battle in the courts. litigation after litigation to try to protect this village, because this village of Hiran, this beautiful village of Hiran, is meant to be destroyed in order to create a Jewish town called Hiran in its place. And if you hear that language, Hiran, Hiran, the language of settler colonialism and the displacing and the erasure of of the language, but kind of using it to the benefit of the settler, is really interesting. So we fought it, and the idea is that Hiran is going to be established as an exclusively Jewish town. And we thought, my God, this is discrimination, so clear, we have all the evidence. In 2015, we lost that case. And this is what set up this is the village of Hiran that's going to be established. This is the plans for it. This is the village of Hiran, and it's really squarely within the residential areas, the zone of residential area for the Jewish residents of Hiran, and nonetheless the state denied it. They want the villagers to leave the land to go to the village of the government planned town of Hura. And in 2018, Bashir, you referenced this, Israel passed a constitutional law. Israel doesn't have a written constitution like Germany or others, but it has a series of basic laws that are elevated to constitutional status. And in this constitution, the settler colonial legal regime of Israel made very clear its relationship to the land and erased totally the Palestinian presence, history, and rights to their land. So it mandates discrimination against non-Jewish people. It says self-determination is exclusive to the Jewish people throughout the land of Israel. An extraordinary amendment. Other kind of main things. I will close with hope. I am a human rights lawyer, so I am relentlessly optimistic and hopeful. And I am hopeful because of the power of the people. I am hopeful because when we recognize that our stories are connected, we are powerful. I am hopeful because I've seen and experienced the power of solidarity. This is a, and it's not new. It's not new, but it feels exciting. And this is just to show you that it's not new. This is the International Indian Treaty Conference in 1980 in Fort Belknap in Montana, the state where I grew up, which had a Palestinian representative. The Palestinian representative came to Montana to speak about a spirit of resistance, to speak about indigenous land and the right to hold on to that land. And it's an extraordinary moment. And here you have the Palestinian Youth Movement, PYM, that went to Standing Rock to show solidarity. I was on a panel like this with Lee Maracle, an incredible indigenous poet from British Columbia, and I was saying, this is a really interesting concept, and indigenous groups together. And she was like, oh yeah, Mahmoud and I used to speak about it a lot. And I was like, Mahmoud? And she's like, yeah, Mahmoud and we exchanged poems. In April, my colleagues and I went to Louisiana, where there's an incredible fight for resistance of the Louisiana pipeline, the extension of the Dakota Access Pipeline, and Palestinian presence there to reiterate a solidarity and a shared struggle. Here at the Equal Justice Initiative Memorial to Lynching that was opened in Montgomery, Alabama in April, we attended and we were with the Porch Creek Indian representative to talk about reclaiming history from Palestine to Turtle Island. And on Monday, in solidarity with Indigenous Peoples Day, Palestinian civil society wrote a statement of support and praising victories in Indigenous Peoples Days and wishing our Indigenous brothers and sisters strength in their continued fight of resistance. It is an honor to be here, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A, and thank you so much.
Columbia University is unique in that this is a place where there's a center for Palestinian Studies, first of all. And second of all, it's a place where we both touch and talk to each other very carefully, with respect, and with the depth of analysis. I think that comes with that kind of conversation between Palestinian and Native and Indigenous studies. And it's my honor once again to be invited to talk to my colleagues that are of Palestine, working for Palestine and working for freedom and justice
along with nuanced analysis. So this is what I want to say. I'm going to be very brief. This is the land acknowledgement, by the way. I shouldn't have to think, but this is letting them out of the land. And we would be remiss if we were to sit here and talk about the total effacement or attempted effacement of a community and a nation of people and didn't acknowledge the very land on which we stand. And it has been memorialized because of the activism of Indigenous and Allied students here at Columbia University. So what I'd like to say, first I'd like to start with one of our shared analysts who puts us in the same frame. And I've heard this before, and it just, I think, hits to the bone. This historian, Benny Morris, he trips me out. He just puts it out there. So he said of people here, the experiences here, in relation to what is going down over there, even if the great American democracy couldn't come to be without the forced extinction of Native Americans, there are times the overall final good justifies the terrible, cruel deeds. Isn't that full of it all? And puts us in the same analytic frame, as if we don't know that already. What I'd like to say about this analytic frame, it is a political, historical, and deliberate practice. Ideology, set of material practices that gets understood as settler imperialism or settler colonialism. And as you know, or you don't know, this grammar of settler colonialism is punctuated with semicolons, with periods, removal. And when I say period, the attempt to put a period to people's lives and their relationship to land, of forced removal, of containment, of confinement, of criminalization, of rendering Indigenous peoples foreigners, trespassers, and criminals on their own land. This is very much what has been unpacked for us today with great historical and legal depth. So what avails itself to us, we think, some think, many are thinking, and what I'm curious about in the context of this incredible piece of forensic archaeology and, as I understand, aesthetic work, this exhibition that we're talking about here is also up for a great art award, which hasn't been said yet, and which I want to think a little bit about, because I see this both as a legal, potentially very persuasive legal document, but also it is something of aesthetic value. And those two things thought together are interesting, right? Do Palestinians, with or without their keys, get exited from that formula or that space of interest? But that's an aside. What I want to just touch upon and press upon is the notion of recognition in a settler liberal democracy that we have ad nauseum. We've had beautifully presented evidence, and for those of us who don't know this, that this is in fact a liberal democracy that undoes its claims to justice every minute, right? With this never-ending, it seems, cycle of catastrophe. These are not catastrophes, these are willful events, willful mechanisms. But the call for recognition, the desire for recognition, the actual, they do this in Canada, they sort of do this in the States, there is a demand always for evidence. Have you been harmed? You know, this language of historical injustice. Liberal theorists like to use historical injustice. It is a very deliberate, concise attempt to, these settler democracies are learning from each other. This is why Indigenous peoples here look to Palestine today and say, that went down 100 years ago. We know what that is, the starvation, the confinement, et cetera, et cetera. So in light of the sort of deep intentionality and probably obfuscation of the learning of these practices from each other, is recognition what we should be going for? And yet, I understand fully, without water, without electricity sometimes, there are without rights, one is truly bare life, bare man, one can be killed without punishment. But I just want to press upon that a bit, because very much to return to the idea of the exhibit is an archive that I think is actionable. And the end game, I think, might be recognition, and I asked them, I said, what does this mean? They said, this could be put on the map, right? So if you're put on the map, is that justice? Is it enough, right? So when we imagine our lives both within and without, beyond states, within states, better states, whatever your thing is recognition the end game, right? It's all I want to put out there for you all. And I learned so much. Once again, I have a lot more to say, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. I don't want to take time away from you, because you should be asking these wonderful interlocutors questions. Thank you.
Okay, so not entirely sure if Brian told me my only role here is as referee. So we have 15 minutes, and unfortunately, I actually teach 4:10. I'm really gonna have to end it before, but I open the floor to questions. I realize it's live, we're running late.
I'm interested in the idea that of Bedouin communities somehow having to prove that they were sedentary in order to access recognition and rights. I mean, perhaps many of those communities were sedentary, I don't know, but there are many Bedouin communities who are mobile and nomadic. So how does that play in? Like, is there an effort by nomadic communities to portray themselves as sedentary in order to access right? Or if there are groups, how both maybe in the Ottoman legal system and then in Israeli systems, is it, and not because there's nation states in the Middle East, right? So how does that influence the nomadic process under which many communities live?
Who wants to?
Great question. Love it. Love it because that is one of the challenges and something that we did in fact differentiate in the Naqab.
Right.
Like we tried to differentiate that in our advocacy and our legal work as well. I mean, this exhibit does the same, right? It's proving kind of sedentization, at least by the time of the Ottomans. So that's different than a lot of nomadic like Bedouin communities in the Middle East, for sure. And it gave us, in fact, we used it, exploited it in some ways. So in 2011, when the Special Rapporteur on Indigenous Peoples made a statement saying that the Palestinian Bedouin are indigenous people because of, and he added, you know, this presence on the land since the 7th century, being sedentized by the Ottomans, in terms of understanding the connection to the land. I would encourage us to really think beyond, as you're already doing it. If you put kind of a rights-based vision forward, rather than villages or land or borders, we're thinking about self-determination beyond these confines of geography. And I think that is where we have a lot of potential in terms of doing advocacy that's actually relevant not only to the Naqab, but to indigenous communities and nomadic communities around the world, that we say wherever you are. The idea of human rights is that you can be protected, you can live as authentically as who you are, with full legal and social and political protection. And I think if we root ourselves in self-determination, that's like where I would envision us going.
You know, let me just want to say one other thing about that, but the distinction also between, there's the legal question, the distinction Debby and Bashir around a kind of Zionist imaginary where part of the fantasy of Bedouin being nomadic was also a way of separating out. So they're not really Palestinians, they're Bedouin. There was a kind of romance, which was both a kind of romance, but at the same time a total denial around that mobility question. So it also has an ideological role, historic, but it's very particular. Anyway, that was just an aside. So. Yes,
Hi, thank you. I was curious to hear more about the Mawat land zoning system, knowing that the unit of measurement still remains the demo. So I'm curious to whether, I mean, why hasn't the state rectified that? Or I've done research on the south of Lebanon and the nomadic communities, and both existing in very similar issues. So if you could speak more about the Mawat and what it means and why have this been not amended? I'm just curious about that.
So the question is why in the Israeli legal system have they not gone away from the what?
Yeah.
As a characterization? I think, and the dunam as a measurement of space. This is so cool. I mean, part of it is as if you saw in the case, the Hawashli case, there's a manipulation of what mawat means that really serves the interests of the settler regime. And I think that's where you start understanding these kind of questions have a pretty simple answer, right? Like, if the powerful can benefit from a characterization of land in this way, then they have, right? And so there's no reason to move away from the mawat doctrine in Israel because it has allowed for the massive confiscation of land. It continues to do so. So in Al-Hawashli, what happened is that they redefined for the Naqab, super interesting, because mawat was related to the space and distance between outside of villages or towns, right? But Bedouin encampments, the state decided in Al-Hawashli, were not, towns in the sense of mawat land, and that the only town that was relevant to the discourse was Beersheba, was Beersheba, but Beersheba was established in 1900, right? So it didn't really, they were using, again, it's manipulation of mawat doctrine to serve the power.
I just want to add to that short. Another important thing is important point is that the mawat area is a desert area, and I think it's much connected in the way that the Zionism had interpreted. I'm not a legal expert, but one of the main prominent points of our project with Yad Weizmann is looking into the area of Al-Araqib is located in the threshold of the desert, and this area, part of it being considered dead is the fact that you cannot grow wheat according to the Zionist Jewish law, because it's allegedly uncultivated. Thank you. So in that sense, it has a strong connection for the desert. And one of the things that our project is trying to do through the kind of, I would say, archaeology of the present is to show those traces through the usage of historical aerial photos that show that and reflect that there had been ongoing cultivation. So I think it's important for me.
Yeah. Bear with me for a question that I'm still kind of putting together, but I was very curious about the ways that physical structures and infrastructures seem to operate differentially in modes of displacement and how it's achieved by the settler state. And so I'm wondering, first of all, if my thinking even makes sense to you, and then I have kind of a broader question, but that the promise of demolition seems to reflect kind of an acute attention by the settler state of subtraction, right? Take the promise to take something away, whereas the promise of construction of infrastructures and the lack of that infrastructure kind of operate as neglect by the settler state through the withholding of the addition of. So thinking about subtractions and additions. And so, first of all, I'm wondering if you see those operating the way that I'm imagining that I've been seeing it here, and also kind of, I'm curious more broadly about the Palestinian relationship to infrastructure.
You want to say a little bit more about that? What do you mean by Palestinian infrastructure?
Well, what do I mean by that? But as potential tools for resistance against. Is that too long, or is I'm sorry?
No. So there's something very, think about the historical process. There's something, there has always been an urgency. Think about 48 as a moment, where expulsion is only part of the process, where the erasure of location, of villages, there are There are some very understandable examples, very easy examples, where you can see whole villages being destroyed, etc. But there are also very, like in all cases, very peculiar examples, like the old city of Tiberias, for example, which had a lot of Jewish property in it. At the time, it was totally destroyed, right? Totally bombed and destroyed. There was something about the process of 48 ongoing, continuous, where the notion that you had sites to return to, and you know, the notions that you have much older civilization that you could build on, return to, reclaim, is a deep problem. So in its physicality, its existence there. So it was different kinds of troops would enter in order really to destroy. There were destruction troops. People were not afraid of the destruction troops because they knew that the destruction troops were not expulsion troops, right? So they only came to destroy the buildings. They wouldn't dispossess. But there was something about this process, about how a process of cleaning out the population is conducted, and why it was essential for a project to succeed, in a sense, to destroy a lot of the villages, to tell them immediately, weeks afterwards, there's nothing to return to. What do you want to return to? This is a core value that is.
I have a question about the concept of the struggle for recognition and refusal in relation to the project that we see downstairs, and also you mentioned earlier about it entering the field of art, no aesthetics. I'm wondering about what is, with all of the power of a project like this, this is something that's, I think, an inherent tension in the work of forensic architecture and projects like these. Now, what is a threat? Now, what is lost when it becomes a necessity to translate narratives into the language of the court that is actually precedent, right? And this is something, it's such an amazing panel, so I'm hoping that some of you can help us work through it.
Did you hear that question, Rebecca? I'm not sure I can totally summarize it, but I was going back to the question of Audra's point about recognition and aesthetics in some sense, which is it's a project that is, you think about the forensic architecture project, which is up for an award in the Tate, right, in London. So on the one hand, it's putting something on the map, but in an aesthetic form that also produces certain kinds of ratios, and also in a language that erases people's narratives, but it has to appear in some other form, both forensic and aesthetic. So, unfortunately, this may have to be our last question, unless I hand off the podium to Brian, which I can do. Sure.
Okay, so thank you, Noah, for this question. So yes, I didn't mention due to a lack of time that the exhibition, which is presented downstairs, is now presented in the Tate as a part of the Terra Prize prestigious exhibition, which is the most important art exhibition, more or less, in prize of contemporary art. Yeah, it's huge, and it's also, I think it's challenging, like you said, Nora, because I think it put in stake the value of forensic architecture evidence production as the status of it as a testimony, as a valid testimony. Now, Yad will tell you that, for him, and I think it's a very interesting discussion, that in a lack of forums where you can present those counter evidence, like he terms it, where the legal system, as Nadia so brilliantly showed us, does not acknowledge, then how can, what can we as human rights activists or people who has some hope in a hopeless world want to do something? So in that sense, art institutes had become, for forensic architecture, this kind of alternative forums. Now there's various forums. There's the forum of Columbia University, and there's the forum of Zochrot, but then there's the forum of the Tate. Now, one of the main risks I think that Eyal is taking here is the depoliticization of his project, because he's choosing also his projects are stunning. They have a very high quality aesthetics nature. And when you see it, sometimes you just lose orientation. It was just a few months ago, we had an exhibition in the ICA in London where we presented something like 7 or 8 exhibitions. So when you see images of the installations, then you lose orientation many times because it's spectacular. So I think they are grappling forensics about, but I think their work is so important and so crucial because in many sense I think they're collecting knowledge and producing evidence that might be used in the future. So in that sense I feel that this is an urgent work to be done and very interesting ethical questions raised from that in terms of the refugee with the key. And this is something that in our joint project with Al-Araqib, I mean the grassroots project and the platform, so how much this project was participatory, how much they could, Aziz and the families of Al-Uqbi and Al-Turi, how much they could use this super sophisticated platform that Forensic had created, but this is going to be part of Sheikh Sayah next trial for the land rights. So I think it acts in a very interesting intersections that are still to be developed.
So we've decided we're gonna keep this going to about 4:15, but I am leaving and Brian is taking.
Nobody wants to go in the rain anyways. And Bashir has come all the way from the UK for this, so we don't want to rush it too much. But if it's okay with the Italian Academy folks, we'll keep it going for another 10 or 15 minutes. Okay? Yes, please.
I just want to hear from you about the legal ramifications of this as we've been talking. If the evidence is always challenging to present in Israeli courts, then what other mechanisms do Bedouin communities have? Is there any possibility of working with the international criminal court system at a point where they have the resistance failed at a time?
I think speaking now on behalf of forensics, that the evidence about creating, especially with the Naqab and with Al-Araqib, so evidence is going to be used in court. Probably it will fail, to be sincere, but I think the hope is that this evidence produced will be taken to international courts, which might or might not have an effect on the Israeli legal system. But as Nadia said, in the case of Al-Hiran, which is less challenging than the case of Al-Araqib in many senses, then they are considered legal on their land. So in that terms, it raises questions that I'm not sure I can answer. Sometimes you feel that you work very hard to produce a very a crucial body of evidence, and then you fail again and again in courts. When Al-Uqbi from Al-Araqib came to the court with all the legal historical documents that you can see in the website and also in the exhibition downstairs in the film. One interpretation of this very notorious historian called Professor Rukar had erased his history, and Al-Uqbi family has been in Al-Araqib since the 16th century. So in that sense, we are grappling with very harsh legal system in Israel, and I think the only hope is the international courts.
Nadia has a question.
I would second Debby. I'm doing my research in Palestine and Kashmir, and this dispossession and this marginalization and erasure is something that is so starkly similar in their cases that that's a question. It may be a question, but it's a rhetorical question which perhaps we don't have an answer. Like you said, that this is something that it's a self-repeating process. So, we have done research in forensics, and then I'm doing the research in literature. I'm studying the literatures of the two lands, and I can see so many similarities. But I don't have the answers to these questions. So if you can just like further on that.
I will try to answer shortly. So one comment would be that part of the research on Al-Araqib had been done also by literature. We used traveler diaries that were used also in Israeli courts, say Al-Araqib that they're related to, that wrote a lot about Al-Araqib, and he'd been walking in the area of Al-Araqib, and it was a year of drought, and this served the Israeli courts to prove that it was a Mawat land. So in that case, we also, literature was also not the main part, but since it was used by the Israeli courts, then we used to analyze it as well. And I think we talked about it a bit yesterday. I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of interesting intersections that can be done. For example, the project, the platform that was developed, the Ground Truth, is now being used by Yazidi refugees in Iraq to document the destruction and erasure that ISIS had passed all around their lands. So they are mapping with kites and with balloons, and they're walking the area, and they're using the platform in order to prosecute in the future. So in that terms, I mean, I think there's a lot of work that can be done through this methodological or research tool that was created to help other communities in which this kind of production of evidence can be done. I hope I answered.
My question is for Nadia, but perhaps professors and professors speak to this. You mentioned the need for evidence of Indigenous peoples beyond their histories, and I was wondering, what does this look like, particularly when there's such a tendency to construct monolithic identities around Indigenous people? So Indigenous existence beyond their histories, Indigenous presence beyond their histories. How can we have that? I mean, this is a fascinating question, and also kind of challenging this notion of indigeneity, which in many ways has come up a lot in Palestine. And maybe you can speak to this as well, Bashir, and making this distinction. So again, using the Palestinian Bedouin community and attachment to land and traditions and culture as proof, again, of indigeneity that is not necessarily applied to Palestinians. So those who are participating in the UN DRIP, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, are the Palestinian Bedouin community specifically, and not just Palestinians as a whole. Do we lose something in terms of self-determination, in terms of rights, in terms of national liberation, that we might lose in indigeneity? So and partially, to be honest, a lot of the work that we're doing in terms of cross-movement building with Indigenous partners in the United States, you have Palestinian human rights defenders and civil society and communities who are saying, my God, like, there's a history of resistance, but really the United States went full force with its settler colonial ambition, and where are the Indigenous people? And my God, like, is this what's happening? Are we looking at our future? And so we're trying to reframe that, right, in terms of rooting not erasure but resistance and refusal as we're building those connections between Indigenous peoples. I'm interested in this challenge, and whether and when indigeneity is useful, and whether we can think beyond indigeneity and again go back to a rights-based framework that applies to people regardless of who they are in terms of self-determination, and use kind of Indigenous history and Indigenous visions of the future of decolonization as a practice for all of us in terms of a collective practice.
That's a really excellent question. In the United States, it's very clear clear when you, indigeneity is defined, of course, by living indigenous people. And that is in contradistinction to the way it's defined by the state with its federal acknowledgement process, which is literally an 8-step plan with criteria that is not determined at all by indigenous peoples. And after 200 years of trying to destroy indigenous peoples and cultures, they have set into place a political and legal definition that's cultural. And for anthropologists, this trips us out because it's a vision of culture that we now walk away from and are somewhat ashamed of. The perfect, hermetically sealed, shared sense of community that settler colonialism seeks also to destroy, along with families and senses of identity. So this 8-step process is like, do you have a political organization? Did you have a chief? Is it archived? If you're running away from invaders, you know, it's they might as well just say, did a white man see you? And write it down. See your difference, record it, write it down, archive it. And this is where the question of evidence to me is fascinating, because the evidence is not usually oral history or, you know, ephemera or, you know, sites of meaning for you. It is what is Durkheimian truth that can be triangulated by trustworthy people, and what's unsaid there are and archived textually. So for people who transmit knowledge orally, or who write in the form of beadwork, or who have truly alternative systems of knowledge, this submission of evidence is very difficult. So indigeneity, I think, exists in 2 modalities. It's the lived experience of people who are caught up in the maelstrom of invasion, and then it's simultaneously, in these settler liberal democracies, so-called liberal democracies, a set of definitions. And what I see this project trying to do in a really cagey way, and I'm using this language, cagey, in the most, it's a smuggling project of evidence, of truth, of submission, but also with the aesthetic performance here, it's something irresistible. So like all these art people, I want to pass judgment on them, I don't know who they are, but they have power, right? In my mind, in my native mind, they have some power. Maybe they'll wake up, right? So this is the hope of recognition also, right? Is maybe they'll wake up and maybe they'll do something. You know, right now the Polaris Prize in Canada, the big music award went to Jeremy Ducher, who's a Maliseet who sings in his language, but is trained in opera. I mean, what a package. So here's Emmy Square. I mean, he just got everything. You know, he's just such a smuggling project. But the old women taught him his language, and he's singing their songs in a form that is irresistible because it is recognizable. But meanwhile, the first song on his album is a death song. So all these non-native, I'm not saying you, but all these listeners of this prize winner are listening to a Maliseet death song. And that language itself was targeted for death, just like Maliseet people. So this is the way I understand these attempts, these performances, these very deliberate and willful archiving evidentiary practices.
So, if I can say something about this question. So, there are a lot of distinctions to be made. One is Israel is not a liberal democracy. Israel is a Jewish state, it belongs to the Jews. This is the definition of the state. The others are, in the way, residents, they will never be equal. Everything kind of bolding. The struggle in Israel-Palestine, and here's where I think there are strong limits to an indigenous perspective over Palestine. The struggle in Israel-Palestine is a national struggle. The Palestinians are Arabs, they are connected to the Arab world, they have different kinds of identities, they're not just connected to Palestine, it has a depth there. The confrontation with Zionism is a national confrontation. If I only go by the indigenous truths, the question you have to ask yourself is very simple in Israel-Palestine. Because, you know, some of these things are like they're like kinds of competition, right? How much do you suffer more, we have bigger. Indigeneity is a little bit like that in Israel-Palestine, because the reason why Jews think they belong in Hebron is exactly because of indigeneity. Because they think their ancestors have been there, they've been swept away in 2000, and they're returning to the land. So my own sense as a it's an interesting mechanism to think about certain communities. It's an interesting mechanism where we flag land. It's an interesting mechanism when we talk about the settler colonial project that dispossesses, that expels. It has its own, as a paradigm, it works. It's an interesting mechanism to draw connections between oppressed peoples, which are always drawn between oppressed peoples across the world, etc. But to only frame the conflict between the Palestinians and the Israelis as a conflict over indigeneity, I think has severe limits. Exactly because the Palestinians don't recognize those things. The Palestinians describe themselves as the originals, the people who were there originally. It's not framed within an indigenous like you have within Native American. It's not framed within those terms. And it also means that the legal dimensions that are connected up with the indigenous conception are different in Israel-Palestine. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict, essentially, we can think about if you dominate a state, if you control its resources, if you control its lawfare, etc., you can set up laws, you can exclude others all the time. But ultimately, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict will have to be determined by politics and by power politics. And the recourse to international law is a recourse to rights and jurisdictions that play out in a certain political competition between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And it is necessary. It is necessary to tell Israel all the time that you are in violation of human rights law, that you are in violation of international law, that everything you do in the West Bank is simply not allowed, that whatever you call it, however long you say you belong there, simply in terms of international law does not matter. Israel has to be told this, because the other framework is much more difficult. You have, you want to use the law in a political struggle, especially when everything that Israel does, this is the benefit of using international law, everything Israel does in Gaza, everything Israel does in the West Bank, etc., even inside Israel, you can have recourse to international law, you can argue for the rights of citizens, or democratic rights, etc. You can utilize it in the struggle. So I'm a little bit more, in a sense, pragmatic about this conception. The question of recognition is an important question. Think about whether the Israelis, to think about the inequality of recognition, right? The fundamental inequality of recognition in Israel-Palestine is, which is, if you think about the Oslo process, where it plays out, where the Palestinians recognize the state of Israel. They renounce violence, they jump through all the American hoops. And what do the Israelis recognize? And this is where you think, shoot me now, kind of moment for political leadership. The Israelis recognize that these people I'm negotiating with represent those people. The PO represents the Palestinians. They don't recognize Palestine. They don't mention the occupation. They don't say that we will allow a state to exist. So again, there are different ways in which that word comes into play in the struggle, which has its own specificity. The other kind of specificity is about the nature, if you like, of your enemy. The Israeli enemy has particular features that are entangled with long suffering of Jews, with anti-Semitism in Europe. Very different kind of features, which makes it extremely difficult for the Palestinians to fight this war, this political war, not really. I don't think any real war with Israel is winnable. You have 350 nuclear warheads. It's a useless war. I think the no war over politics. So I think it has its own, it's a kind of a nightmare scenario for that. You want to have a nightmare scenario for a national population to fight, this is it. Right? Where you have the ultimate victims of 20th century history laying claim to a land which wanting to set up a state there, they dispossess you, and the recourses you have are very limited recourses, and the power you have is very limited power. And not only that, the environment around you, its leaderships, its capacities, its militaries, has totally abandoned you. That's where the indigenous has its limits. Arabs simply abandoned Palestine, political regimes. Right? So it has its own complexity, where the term indigeneity simply does not cover this.
First of all, I just want to thank you all. You've given us so much to think about. And I just wanted to go off from the former questions and talking about recognition. And specifically speaking to your point about did the white man see you? It's really spoke to me. And perhaps Nadia can also speak to this a bit. Specifically, I just wanted to ask about the dynamics of recognition, because being recognized also sort of recognizes power of the person recognizing it. So, and I wanted to ask how the law can sort of escape that, and does it serve any emancipatory potential outside of recognition? Because using the courts recognizes the legitimacy of the courts. in a certain sense. And I wanted to ask if there's space for the law, and if there is, how it's being used to sort of challenge that without also conceding something in the process. Anyway.
The answer is
Yeah.
which law? The answer is which law? Is it any law, national law?
Great question. I mean, these are the questions that we need to wrestle with, and you have to put yourself also in the space of advocacy and imagining the world that you want, right? And what are the tools that you have to get there, right? So if you keep your head and your mind on the prize, your eyes on the prize, if it were, then you use things strategically. You use the tools strategically, and you don't lose sight. We're not in the court, necessarily thinking we will win, right? We know that we're trying to create the conditions that if we win, we win. But if we lose, we also win, right? And when we lose, we don't say we lost. We say that justice was lost, right? So you're using the courts strategically. So you have, if you make clear why you're using the courts and what you're trying to achieve, then you don't get lost in this legitimization game, the struggle. We're not there to, what does it mean if you are challenging and you are demanding your humanity before the Israeli courts, and the courts say you are not equal? How in the world did that legitimize this regime? It only exposes the regime for what it is, which is a discriminatory regime that privileges the rights of certain people on the basis of who they are, and it forces the oppressed to go before them and demand their humanity. I mean, that's the historical record that you're creating, and so you're not legitimizing the regime by doing that, I think. Recognition and the process of recognition, this sort of subversive potential of it, I think is really interesting, what you asked, and emancipatory potential. In the Naqab, again, these like brilliant Palestinians who were using the courts in a really interesting way did, in the early 2000s, something called creeping recognition through the courts. So they said, okay, so let's look at the Israeli legal regime and what do they say we are allowed to have as human beings? So if it's kindergartens for, so there was clinics, for example, so there's universal health care in Israel for citizens of Israel. So they're like, dope. There's universal health care, so we need a clinic that we can use. So there were clinics that were established in 11 of the recognized villages. And they're like, okay, cool. So next, little kids under the age of 3 are allowed to have education access in Israel. So it's a socialized space. So let us go and say there's a lot of little Bedouin kids. And they said, okay, fine, you need like daycares. And the court will allow this. And suddenly they were creating the infrastructure, which I don't know who, one of your colleagues who was talking about it, to then suddenly say the facts on the ground. So this is Israel's big project, that they create facts on the ground and then legitimize those facts on the ground. The Palestinian community was saying, let's turn the game around. It's brilliant. So there are possibilities, and I think the most important thing is to know what you're fighting for, right? And to know the ambition, and the ambition is decolonization, the ambition is collective liberation. And when you have your sights there, then you use the tools that are available to you, the law, the human rights treaty bodies, art, architecture and archaeology. You know, you're using that with purpose, and it's one of the most exciting things you can do. So I would just ask for you to find your joy in that plethora of options that you have to advance justice, and use that.
Final question.
My question is, does Israel use literally, covertly, overtly document discovery in its laws in the same way that it's used on this side of the planet? So by the U.S., Canada, other countries, Guatemala.
It uses the
That's
doctrine of
something
return.
I really wondered about.
It uses the doctrine of return. Now this is a group of people that are returning to their ancient lands, ancestral lands, and look at the lands now and how they have been neglected by those people. They've been occupying them, they haven't cultivated those lands. We will be able to cultivate them better. We are returning not only to our land, but are returning to ourselves as Jews. So it is, the whole framework is a framework of return. Hence, again, the limit of indigenous argument in these questions. So it's not discovery, they're not discovering them. They're returning to themselves by returning to them.
Zionism as a political ideology really sets its science in this sort of concept of chosenness, and God is a real estate agent, as he was or she was here in this land, and God is a real estate agent for Palestine. and allows that sort of intention. The political project of Zionism was rooted in that idea that this land belongs, certainly through return, but in that same concept, that this area of land belongs to certain people and not to the indigenous people or native people.
But the thing is, it's a legal construct. I mean, the doctrine of discovery was incorporated into U.S.
So the law of return.
My question was about the law.
That's it, sorry.
Like,
so the law of return.
Exactly what you're saying about the...
So the law of return in 1950, passed in 1950, allows any Jewish person anywhere in the world to automatically become a citizen of the State of Israel. And it uses this concept of we're ingathering the exiles, so we're bringing people back, but the law of return says that this land belongs to Jews, to the Jewish people, and they can come to that land. So it is enshrined in law, this concept of this land belonging to the,
religion.
A religion.
It's called religion. There's no state in the world that defines itself as belonging to a whole religion. There are states that go to Muslim law in order to legislate, etc. Iran is a Muslim state, but Israel is the only state that claims to belong to a whole religion.
But I think the word could be redemption. That, and then once I just like a short story before I came here, before I moved to the U.S. I was very curious about how these groups of settlers do these tours of the Muslim quarter, which they called the rejuvenated Jewish quarter. And they took me around to see these houses, and they said, and I just asked them, so what's going on? And they just showed me how they confiscate houses, basically. But they said, we redeemed this house from this person, and they do it through the legal system. But when they do the tour, they say, we redeemed this house from that house, and kind of to understand how that language goes into law within that setting really also sets the tone of what kind of emotional, psychological, pathological motives are at play within that, so-called democracy. So it's very interesting to look at those languages, and of course also so through the U.S.
So it's Terra and Nullius, unless the land is occupied by Jews in the same way. Terra and Nullius could be claimed by Christians. That's it. Because the Bedouins, the Palestinians, were taken to meet them, so I believe that translations people are. It's the same thing. But it's
James Baldwin, to end command, James Baldwin. James Baldwin says that you think your pain and your heartbreak are unprecedented in the history of the world, and then you read.
Okay, thanks for coming, everyone. Thank you, Nadia, Bashir, Debby, Audra, and the other Nadia. Thank you. Thank you.